Greetings, great guys, and welcome back to What If Goku Was an Avatar. This is part 6. But before we continue, let's just do a quick recap of what happened in the last part. Right, so Admiral Zhao went on a little vacay to the woods, the very same woods where Zhongzhong's camp is located. Of course, he was there to try and catch Aang, not go wild camping. But his hunt didn't go too well. Aang and Toku got more time with Zhongzhong than Aang did in the original, and Sokka, Katara and Zhongzhong himself were there to defend the camp as well. So the group sent the Admiral home with a medal of shame and humiliation, then proceeded to fly towards the Northern Water Tribe. Once they got there, they were treated almost like royalty, being the honourable guests from the south, and Aang got to train with Master Paku. And after some commotion, a little fight, and a pinch of drama, Katara was permitted to join in. Toku and Sokka, on the other hand, decided to go sightseeing. There were many new things in the Northern Water Tribe that they didn't have back at home. This would be interesting. Some time went by, and eventually the Fire Nation attacked. This attack was led by Admiral Zhao, but this time without General Iroh. He and Zuko were elsewhere. Now, if you remember, Part 5 ended on a little cliffhanger, with Toku finally coming face to face with the full moon which he had avoided for so long, causing him to turn into the Great Ape once again. And now that we're all caught up, let's move on to Part 6. So there he stood, towering over everybody, raging and beating his chest. Untrained Ozaros aren't really in control over their own actions, as you probably know. They mainly just either smash things at random, or things that provoke or attack them. Normally Toku as an ape would have wrecked the whole Northern Water Tribe, but thanks to the Fire Nation being so hostile towards him, his main focus was to smash the little insects in red armour, shooting flames at his legs. Sokka, being a clever and quick-thinking warrior and tactician, took this moment of distraction to try and explain to any other waterbenders who were still there, that is, that this was Toku, and that he had transformed due to the full moon. This information calmed some of the water warriors, as the ocean and moon spirits were some of their greatest allies. None of them had actually ever seen the spirits, so they wouldn't know what physical form they actually had, but Zhao had. He had done his research in the old library, and knew of course that the spirits were the koi fish. But most of the Water Tribe members had only ever guessed. With that being said, it's quite likely that they'd think that the moon spirit was channeling its power through Toku. I mean, why else would he have transformed during a full moon? Especially with Sokka there, telling them that this had happened before, under similar circumstances. It was only thanks to Sokka that Toku didn't burn to a crisp. Many other waterbenders were now focusing on putting out the fires that the firebenders were starting on Toku's gorilla fur. Sure, Toku in his current form may have been powerful enough to utterly flatten the whole Fire Nation in 30 seconds. But we can't forget these points. For starters, he's covered in fur from head to toe. Secondly, he's being bombarded with fire and flammable fireballs that may, of course, get stuck in his fur. And 3, he's not in control and is mostly trying to stomp on the Fire Nation soldiers or pick them up. It's not uncommon for great apes for some reason to pick one person up at a time and get distracted. A lot of the Fire Nation soldiers were now debating on whether they really wanted to stay and fight this battle, but after some thinking, most of them stayed put. Sure, the monster gorilla was big and scary, but in all honesty, he seemed to have done more direct and purposeful damage to them when he was still a human. Granted, the outer walls were getting pretty beat up, and the soldiers he did get a hold of ended up suffering way more damage than Toku would have done if he would have been in control. Toku isn't mean and sadistic, but you see, he didn't hold back as a great ape. Anyway, as a whole, for most of the soldiers, it was almost easier to battle with a gorilla there instead of the effective key-bending, super-strength boy. Now, let's leave him for a second and see what Aang's up to. Back at the spiritual oasis, or whatever it's called, the pond, Aang was in deep meditation. Due to the mesmerizing fish swimming round and round in circles, he had actually managed to make it into the spirit world. One thing that's different here though, is that he won't be getting help from Heibai to find his way back to the mortal world. This is because he never met and befriended the panda like he did in the original. We skipped those, didn't we? Sure, you could argue that Roku instead would have shown him the way back, but I don't think that he would, because, I mean, he could have done that in the original, but he didn't. Instead he delegated, or perhaps he couldn't, so he just told Heibai to do it. But here, Heibai wasn't his friend, so I'm just going to say that it took Aang a bit to get back. It might seem like an irrelevant or unimportant piece of information, but it's quite relevant and you'll see why. Remember in canon, when he awoke, quicker thanks to Heibai that is, the gang had to fly all the way back from that cave that Zuko dragged them to, and when they reached the oasis once again, that's where they met Admiral Zhao, who was intending on killing the moon spirits. In my what if, they never even had to make that flight from the snowy cave, because Zuko never kidnapped him. But due to Aang being a little bit late back into the mortal realm, in my what if, it didn't matter that he, Katara, and Yue, see I pronounced her name right this time, were already by the pond from the start. You see, Zhao and his men had made it into the pond before Aang had even awoken. So, for a split second, Katara had to face those fire soldiers on her own. Princess Yue simply fled and told Katara she'd call for help. Considering Zuko's slightly more skilled than Zhao, or at least if he's not injured, like before, and Canon Katara could beat Zuko during a full moon, Katara here would have been able to take Zhao as well, only he had 4 firebenders with him.
Well, 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 what have we here? The moon spirits, and the Avatar out of commission, on a trip to the spirit world, no doubt. This must be my lucky day.
Zhao started walking towards the pond where Aang and the fish were, while making hand gestures to his men to take care of Katara. Katara realised this and quickly grabbed a hold of Aang and tried to waterbend them away. To try and battle 5 firebenders while keeping Aang safe was perhaps stretching one's luck a little bit too much, even if there was a full moon. The best she could hope for here, considering she was alone, was probably to take Aang and flee, though I'm sorry to say she didn't get very far. She had almost made it to the exit, but all of a sudden her waterbending stopped working. She fell onto the grass with a thud, dropping Aang as well. When she looked up towards the soldiers running towards her and Aang, she realised that the sky was all red, and Zhao was laughing, talking to himself in a mad and victorious voice. He was bragging aloud and letting anyone who would listen know that he would go down in history as a legend, as Zhao the Conqueror, Zhao the one who slayed the moon spirits, Zhao the one who caught the Avatar, all in a day's work as an admiral of his stature. It was at this point Katara realised that the fish he had caught must have been the moon spirits. She made a hasty movement to stop him, just out of reflex, but of course, nothing happened. What was she going to do now? All alone to protect Aang against 5 firebenders and without any bending. Oh, and if you thought that Iroh was going to show up and stop him, well, you were mistaken. He was out at sea somewhere, either sleeping or worrying about the moon which had turned red. That's not very normal. On the bright side, Aang had just returned to the mortal world and woken up. He was of course a bit confused at first. Taking in a scene like this would understandably take a few seconds, but before he had even got the chance to stand up, Zhao had noticed him waking up and decided to quickly slay the fish, causing the moonlight to disappear entirely. Now, we'll get back to this scene shortly, but there are a lot of things going on here at the same time, so we need to reverse the clock a few minutes and see how all of this went down, but on the battlefield where Toku and Sokka were. The battle was a fierce one. Toku had half-consciously stomped and therefore crushed several of the Fire Nation tanks, but also smashed the tops off some of the ice buildings with the erratic movements of his arms. On the bright side, the waterbenders would be able to repair this sort of damage with their bending, though of course, it's a bit annoying. They only hoped he wouldn't accidentally smash one of them, so they kept their distance and continued to put out the fire on his fur caused by the firebenders. But suddenly, something very, very weird happened. The entire sky went red, and not like it did during a sunset or sunrise. The moon was still very visible, but it was also rather red. They weren't all sure what this actually meant, but one thing was for sure, they could no longer waterbend like they did before. As for Toku, well, he'd sort of continue being in Uzaru, but kind of not. The moon was still visible at this point, only different. I do believe the amount of Blutz waves reaching Earth would change though, well, either the amount, or it would be the same amount, but the waves would mutate or change. Perhaps the wavelength would be longer, seeing as the more red a colour is, the longer the waves are, if we take a look at the light spectrum. In any case, I think this would result in Toku's form sort of mutating a bit. Without the correct Blutz waves, he started to shrink a little, lost some fur, and then he gained slightly more self-consciousness. But nobody ever found out what would have become of this new mutation, as not long after the sky went red, the sky changed again. This time, the moon seemed to vanish altogether, causing Toku to revert back into a boy. Everything went pitch black, and only when the firebenders shot flames towards the water warriors did the environment light up. As bad as this whole moon business was, it made it possible for some of the water warriors to retreat unnoticed in the dark. But they couldn't all run off, Sokka, for instance, had to stay and try and get hold of Toku. Indeed, he had been their greatest weapon, human or gorilla. But at the moment, he was just a naked boy, sleeping in the snow. If we think back to Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, untrained Uzori users always pass out after having transformed. After some searching, Sokka was able to locate Toku and lift him up. Some of the Fire Nation soldiers caught sight of this, but they simply stayed in line and marched through the Ice City as if they had just won the war, and were now taking over everything. One thing worth noting though, is that the marching group of soldiers were only about half the size compared to Cannon. The fact that Toku had been there fighting, at least for a little while, had ensured this. If he had not transformed that night, he would have skillfully gotten rid of or tied up most of the Fire Nation soldiers single-handedly. Now that we're all caught up with Aang and Katara, time-wise, let's go back to the pond where Zhao's got them cornered. Right, so back at the pond, we have Aang and Katara against Zhao and all of his men. Aang's got his airbending, but not his waterbending, unless in the Avatar state and fused with the ocean spirit, and Katara hasn't got any bending at all, at least not at the moment. The princess isn't there, but even if she was, she wouldn't give up her life immediately to the fish, as that was sort of Iroh's idea in the original, and he isn't there. So instead, I see Aang grabbing hold of Katara and fleeing the scene. If Azula was there, she could have probably caught up with Aang if he was carrying Katara, but Azula isn't here right now. This is Admiral Zhao, and he never struck me as the nimble type. So here, they got away. Angrily, Zhao then flung the dead fish back into the pond and ordered his men to find him. Sure, he was quite angry that Aang had just gotten away, but in his eyes, he had just conquered the water tribe. It was hard to feel too disappointed. Soon, Aang and Katara bumped into Sokka carrying Toku. He was still out cold. Sokka explained what had happened on the battlefield, how things were going fantastic, but then how Toku transformed, and how that complicated things. But that despite that, they were still winning. Well, until the moon disappeared, causing Toku to shrink and all the waterbenders to lose their bending. He didn't understand how the moon could just disappear. Also, this confirmed it to him. Toku must have been possessed or had been touched by the moon spirit, because when the moon went, Toku lost her transformation. Katara corrected him and told him that couldn't be the case. She and Aang just saw Zhao kill the moon spirit, which made the moon, or at least the moonlight, vanish. It turns out the moon spirit was the koi fish. Of course, the whole Toku case was still a big question mark, but they didn't have time to think about that right now. They had to come up with a plan, and quickly. Sokka told them that the Fire Nation were pushing themselves towards the heart of the city, but that there was still some resistance. All of the non-bending warriors were still there with their weapons, and they could fight, but they would not be able to hold back all of the firebenders and the tanks for long. Now, a quick interruption. I just have to explain why Aang didn't straight away merge with the ocean spirit when the moon spirit died. Well, in canon, the scene was calm. There were no evil soldiers attacking them at the time. It was just the gang, Iroh, and the princess. Also, Princess Yue may have triggered something in Aang when she cried out that everything was over. I mean, who knows, maybe Aang would have said, "No, it's not over," anyway, but I don't think so. I mean, his priority in this what if was to get Katara to safety and not jump into the pond and greet the black fish. Okay, back to the story. This is where I think Princess Yue would have come running towards the gang, slightly for plot reasons, but also because Princess Yue did actually say she'd be calling for help and would therefore return. But she didn't return alone. She had 4 warriors with her. They quickly realised though that they weren't really needed because the action by the pond was already over. Zhao had left and the moon spirit was dead. But to their surprise, the ocean spirit was still alive. Sokka guessed the answer to this surprise. "I bet Zhao didn't see any point wasting his time by the pond anymore. He had killed what he came to kill, and knew the waterbenders couldn't fight back anymore. He's probably out there right now, looking for you, Aang." The warriors Yue had brought with her looked at the group with worried eyes. "This means the end. The Northern Water Tribe will fall." And this is what triggered it for Aang in my what if. All hope was gone. He had been too late back again, just like with the monks. Only this time, he did actually come back. He may have been late, but he did return, and the people were still alive, and he was not about to fail them. Suddenly, his tattoos started to glow as he spoke.
"No, it is not the end,"
he replied to the warrior who was now on his knees. Aang then proceeded to do what he did in the original and took a dip in the pond to merge with the ocean spirits. As that was going on, Sokka and Katara turned their attention towards their youngest brother. After splashing some water on his face, he awoke. His last memory was him and Sokka fighting on the battlefield and winning, so he was obviously very confused. Sokka and Katara took it in turns to explain what had happened, a few sentences at a time. And almost before they had finished, he quickly stood up with an angry but determined look on his face.
I gotta help him. I'm going back out there. Wait, Toku, we need...
But he was already gone. But thanks to the interesting conversation they had with Toku before he left, Yue got an idea. Toku didn't care too much about his siblings' theories about him having been touched by the moon spirit, hence the transformation. Especially not now. He was just keen on getting back out there to help Aang stop the invasion. But Yue had caught on to something. Touched by the moon spirit. Maybe that's what she had been all those years ago. And so she went on to tell them about her past. How she had been sort of born in a deep sleep, and how she hadn't woken up until her parents prayed to the spirits, then put her in this very pond, the very same pond the ocean and moon spirits swam in. Even though none of them had known back in the day that the koi fish were the actual spirits. Now I'm just guessing that nobody knew this back in the day, because if they did, then surely Aang would never have gone into the spirit world in the original to find out who the spirits were. Yue could have just told him, but obviously she never knew until later. Anyway, Katara looked at her with a slight stunned expression.
So in a way, the moon spirit gave you life?
Yeah, it must have. Some of its life force still remains inside of me. Maybe I can give it back.
Once more, we have left the pond to check on the battlefield. Aang was slicing and dicing away, just like in the original, and Toku had actually stopped. He was gazing up towards Aang and the ocean spirit, or the merged version of both of them. He had never really stopped to think about just how powerful the Avatar state was. And then it clicked. This form. This power. No wonder people had assumed in the past that perhaps Toku was the Avatar or had been possessed by a spirit. A giant, powerful, smashing spirit monster? Yeah, that description felt familiar somehow. Anyway, after a few more seconds of staring, he continued his running, taking down any firebenders he happened to run into. Some were knocked out. Others he caught in energy shackles, which he then rammed into the ice so they couldn't run away. Of course, the firebenders would be able to melt said ice, but it would take some time, and they'd still be in shackles. At least until Toku decided to free them, got knocked out, or perhaps got too far away. On his way down to the great outer wall, he had taken down a few dozen soldiers, but to his surprise, there weren't many to fight off.
That's odd. Where are all the tanks?
He then looked beyond the wall and out towards the sea and saw something unexpected. The Fire Nation were actually fleeing with their battleships, and to make matters better, Aang was giving the entire fleet a real boost by the looks of it. Toku had never seen waves quite that large, and he thought to himself that those waves might even be larger than the ones he had created when practicing energy beams out at sea. Of course, then his energy was focused on the beam itself and not creating waves, but still, he was impressed with Aang's power nevertheless. Oh, by the way guys, I think this is the perfect opportunity to do some power scaling or comparisons. I don't really want to keep talking about power levels too much in this What If, as Toku is the only one who really has a power level in the Dragon Ball Z sense. Sure, the others have like human or maybe slightly above human power, but I don't think their bending is classed as ki control, at least not in my opinion. Maybe you guys disagree, but I like to separate them as both shows or series portray the characters' abilities very differently. Anyway, Toku's power level here is around 60. It may not have grown as much here as in the original, but he hasn't had a martial arts master who knows how to train people to get stronger in that way. All of the masters he's met here have been bending masters, though I will say his ki control here is way higher than in the original. Not necessarily higher as in his power level being higher, but he knows more about ki control, and this is because he studied the other benders. He's tried to copy them, gotten inspired, and experimented a lot more. In the original Dragon Ball, Master Roshi's Kamehameha Wave was one of the few ki moves we ever saw, at least in the beginning. We also have the Doden Raid, but never mind. Old school Goku was more about hand-to-hand combats, or head-to-head combats. Right, back to the story. As I was saying, Aang and also Toku, to some extent, had in no time at all gotten rid of the whole Fire Nation, though the ocean spirit was still mad and kept sending powerful waves towards the ships. But at least the day was saved. Or was it? We have 3 issues to discuss. Issue number 1. What would become of all the Fire Nation soldiers that Toku had knocked out and chained up? Well, it's a bit hard to say. I don't think we ever saw a prison in the Water Tribe, at least not in Avatar The Last Airbender. However, we did get to see a Water Tribe prison in Avatar The Legend of Korra. Also, there must have been some crooks or baddies in the North Pole, considering there were way more people there compared to the South Pole, so at a wild guess, there was probably some form of prison somewhere. It's just, I don't see the Water Tribe killing the remaining fire soldiers. Maybe they'd just let them go. Yeah, let's say the punishment would be getting thrown out of the Water Tribe, considering all the Fire Nation ships were now gone. I'd say that's a pretty tough punishment. They'd have to survive out in the cold and make it all the way back to the Fire Nation, but on their own. Ah yes, a good old banishment. Not that they were ever welcome to begin with, but you know. Okay, that's issue 1 sorted out. Now for issue 2. Issue 2 is the fact that Yue had just figured out how she could restore balance by giving back her life force to the dead moon spirit. Now, why would this be an issue? Well, Toku is now awake, and it's still night, or dark at the very least, so I believe he had transformed back into the Ozaru again. Maybe he'd be worn down, or a bit tired, or weak, or whatever, because, you know, transforming twice in one night probably wears you down a bit. But even if he wouldn't be at full power, I'm willing to bet that he'd still gain at least a 7 times boost, putting him at a power level of 420. That's still enough to smash things up pretty badly, even if he wasn't tired. This is where I mentioned issue 3 as well, which is Zhao. In the original, he had made it further into the city compared to the tanks, so he never made it back onto the boats in time. Also, he was cut off by Zuko, and they had their fights, but then the Ocean Spirit killed him and took its revenge. Here, however, Zuko never attacked him, so he made it a little bit further, all the way to the outer wall. I don't like Zhao much though, so I'm still gonna have him killed, only in my what if he got stomped on by Toku. It was by accident, of course, sort of. So anyway, that's issue 3 taken care of. Now back to issue 2, because Toku is still a danger to the Water Tribe. He didn't smash quite as much this time, because this was his 3rd transformation, and perhaps some of his consciousness had remained this time? But he needed help. Aang and the Ocean Spirit saw this, and made their way towards Toku. Let's call them Fish Aang to make things simpler, that way I don't have to say Aang and the Ocean Spirit every single time. I think in a fight, Toku in his Ozaru form would still smash Fish Aang up pretty bad, but thanks to their ability to become a stream of water, or shapeshift, or you know what they did in the original, they'd still be able to get to Toku without provoking him. After all, they didn't want to fight him, they just wanted to calm him down, or help him somehow. Once they reached him, Fish Aang lightly wrapped themselves around Toku's whole body, and when Aang had made it to Toku's face, he tapped the gorilla's forehead, and great shiny light beams appeared. Very similar to how Aang calmed down the Heibai spirit, only this time, we also had the help of the Ocean Spirit. The spirits are very ancient entities, and I'm sure they'd know how to deal with this sort of stuff. After the shiny light disappeared, Fish Aang unwrapped themselves, and Aang was separated from the Ocean Spirit, who made its way back to the pond to reunite with the Moon Spirit, which was now alive. But by the outer wall stood Aang and also giant Toku, still in his Ozaru form. Yes, he was still a grey tape. There were still Blutz waves present, and he still had his tail. There's nothing the Avatar State or Moon Spirit or anyone can do about that. But his mind was different. Fish Aang had managed to reach Toku's consciousness and bring it out further. Maybe not all the way, but he was at least 80% there, so pretty much like himself, just a bit hot-tempered. Toku now looked down upon Aang and gave him a massive thumbs up, which Aang returned. And to find out what happens next, you'll have to wait for part 7. I want to say thanks for watching this video, and also make an announcement. I'm thinking about releasing the first episode of What If Gohan Was Never Born. I'm not sure when, and then from there, alternate what episode I choose to release. So like, next time I put out a video, it might be the Avatar one, and then back to the Gohan one, then Avatar, then Gohan, and so on. Just so we get a bit of variation on the channel for those who might not like the Avatar one, or those who might not like the Gohan one. But we'll see.